were you in 1965? Some of you not born yet. I was 12. Sheltered, might say corralled, in an Iowa conservative household. Privileged and denied by housing segregation much possibility of knowing any African Americans. Yet I did watch the TV news. I saw police beating nonviolent protesters, charging at them on horses, attacking them with dogs, the violence of fire hoses, crowds of white people shouting hatred. Though I had no background information, nonviolence showed me that clearly the police, the racists, were in the wrong. Nonviolence led me toward a prejudice against Southern whites and a sympathy for Southern African Americans. But I didn't know much. I didn't know that Selma was the center of a campaign launched in January of '65 because less than 2% of eligible African Americans were able to vote due to Jim Crow suppression and the violence that went right along with it. I wasn't aware of the Black Teacher Rally or the arrest of Martin Luther King and 500 marching children, or that patrol cars had chased 165 black teenagers out of town. That on February 18th, more nonviolent marchers were brutally attacked, and young Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot, killed by a state trooper. In response, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. announced the march to Montgomery. I didn't know that 55 years ago to yesterday, March 7th, was Bloody Sunday, prompting Reverend King to issue his famous call to clergy. The telegram, no Facebook, email, Twitter, included these words: in the vicious maltreatment of defenseless citizens of Selma, where old women and young children were gassed and clubbed at random, we have witnessed an eruption of the disease of racism, which seeks to destroy all of America. No American is without responsibility. I call, therefore, on clergy of all faiths, representative of every part of the country, to join me for a minister's march to Montgomery on Tuesday morning, March 9th. In this way, all America will testify to the fact that the struggle in Selma is for the survival of democracy everywhere in our land. The words of Martin Luther King. Well, 40 UUs, including our congregation's minister, Reverend Robert O'Brien, left that night. Altogether, over 450 clergy joined over 2,000 African Americans for the second march. After praying at the site of Bloody Sunday attack, though, King led the marchers back to Selma. That night, leaving a restaurant, 2 UU ministers were attacked, clubbed, beaten terribly. Reverend James Reeb died from his injuries. In his eulogy for Reverend Reeb, Dr. King preached, "What killed James Reeb? When we move from the who to the what, the blame is wide and the responsibility grows." Among others, King blamed the irrelevancy of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a taillight rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. And those who stand on the sidelines in the midst of a mighty struggle for justice. He concluded, we must substitute courage for caution. We must be concerned about the system, the way of life, the philosophy that produced the murder. We must work passionately, unrelentingly, to make the American dream a reality, so that he did not die in vain. The words of Martin Luther King at Reverend Reeves' eulogy. The next day, after participating in one of the many sympathy marches around the nation, housewife and mother, as they said in those days, Yu, Viola, Greg, Luizzo, came to join the marchers in Selma too. A week later, several UUs were part of the 300 demonstrators who walked all the way to Montgomery. 4 days, 50 miles. This time accompanied by the National Guard. As they reached the Capitol, the procession grew until there were 25,000. That night, Viola Luizzo was shot, killed, while providing rides home for tired marchers. The Reverend Robert O'Brien, our minister, returned to Monterey, and he shared his Selma experiences with the community beyond the church, to reporters, to classes, even to school assemblies. In August, thanks in largest part to the strategy, the courage, and the martyrdom of the Selma marchers, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. 3 years later, I was on a high school trip to Washington, D.C., when Reverend King was killed. I saw our Capitol under martial law, armed soldiers, APCs patrolling the streets, a strict curfew. When Congress reopened, I witnessed the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, barring housing discrimination, and joined in the cheering, thinking of the courageous marchers of Selma. Our words for meditation this morning were written by the Reverend Kathleen McTeague and titled, They Are With Us Still. In the struggles we choose for ourselves, in the ways we move forward in our lives and bring our world forward with us, it is right to remember the names of those who gave us strength in this choice of living. It is right to name the power of hard lives well lived. We share a history with those lives. We belong to the same motion. They too were strengthened by what had gone before. They too were drawn on by the vision of what might come to be. Those who lived before us, who struggled for justice and suffered injustice before us, have not melted into the dust and have not disappeared. They are with us still. The lives they lived hold us steady. Their words remind us and call us back to ourselves. Their courage and love evoke our own. We, the living, we carry them with us. We are their voices, their hands, and their hearts. We take them with us, and with them choose the deeper path of living. Our reading this morning comes from the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted. Hatred and bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that. We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds which precipitate and perpetuate war. One day, we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal. We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means. We shall hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. And now, I'd like to bring up our guest speaker for this morning, Mr. Drew Glover.
Good morning. Good morning. Today we're talking about history, the history of Selma, the history of justice. But today I want us not just to acknowledge the past, but I want to share my understanding of the present and my vision of the future of Selma. Keep in mind, in 1965 I wasn't even born yet. I wouldn't experience life until another 20 years later. But, right? But the work that was done through the voting rights movement, the civil rights movement, and yes, the abolitionist movement impacts me even today. And it allows me to be here before you. The story of Selma is the story of everyday people fighting for what they thought was right. Fathers, mothers, students, faith leaders, educators, all facing the threat of injury or death to fight for justice. We know the famous names of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Dr. Bernard Lafayette, but we must also acknowledge the work that was happening long before those iconic figures got there. Work done by everyday people like you and me. It was hard work. In the segregated South, violence towards blacks who stood up for their rights was common, harsh, and brutal. But even amongst such violence, the practice of nonviolent social change succeeded in changing not just Selma, but the world. It was not without sacrifice, and certainly not without courage, which is the theme. Nonviolence is a powerful weapon. Oftentimes, however, there's a deep and dangerous misunderstanding of what nonviolence is. Many, who do not know the teachings of Dr. King or Gandhi, believe it to be weak, passive, and simply the absence of violence. This could not be further from the truth. What they're describing is non-violence. In Kingian nonviolence, we make the distinction between King's violence as a single word and nonviolence with a hyphen. King's nonviolence was creative, active, engaged, and addressed the root causes of issues to create what Dr. King considered a positive peace, which is peace with not just the absence of violence, but the presence of justice. Today I want to walk you briefly through the 6 principles of nonviolence and how they relate to our lives, our action, and our fight for justice. The first principle, which is good for today, is that nonviolence is the way of life for courageous people. Dr. Lafayette, who led the voting rights movement in Selma, often tells the story about how Selma, during the movement, people were too afraid to organize because, in his words, white folks were too mean and black folks were too scared. Sit with that for a moment. The courage that was shown by Dr. Lafayette and the foot soldiers that marched across the bridge also makes me think of Reverend Reeb, the faith leader from the United Universalists, and his answer to Dr. King's call. He's a great example of someone practicing Kingian nonviolence. If he were practicing passive nonviolence, nonviolence with a hyphen, when the marchers on Bloody Sunday had been beaten back across the bridge and the violence had subsided, he would not have come. He would have been complacent in what Dr. King called a negative peace, or the absence of tension with the absence of justice. Instead, Reverend Reed stood up and came to fight for the cause, even at the cost of his own life. It's important that we make this distinction because it provides us with the ability to understand the power of nonviolence. And this principle doesn't just apply to people involved in marches or nonviolent actions during a campaign. Nonviolence is a way of life. It applies to all of us, every moment of every day. Because to be a nonviolent person, and to practice Kingian nonviolence, you're not nonviolent some of the time, you're nonviolent all of the time. At least you strive to be. Anytime you see injustice, you take steps to correct it. Anytime you see suffering, you do what you can to alleviate it. It's a constant practice, but it's also an intentional way of life. And you may stumble at times. You may fall. But what's important is that you get up and you keep practicing. Now, most of us are familiar with the history of Selma, which we got to hear a little bit about, but fast forward to today, and the city is still filled with kind-hearted people who care for each other. I got back from Selma this past Tuesday after a 9-day trip of nonviolence trainings and celebrating the historic bridge crossing. We returned to Santa Cruz on Super Tuesday, where I was able to vote. Now, this is powerful when you put it in the context of Selma and the sacrifice made for the voting rights movement. My first trip was in 2017 to receive training and certification in Kingian nonviolent conflict reconciliation from Dr. Bernard Lafayette, his amazing wife Kate, and the staff at the Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation. As I was trained in the sacred space, and this place steeped in history, I had a realization that others needed to experience what I was experiencing, because the trip changed me. To be in a place with such history, such spiritual power, changed my perspective. And I always say that I found my blackness in Selma. It connected me to my roots beyond anything I'd ever experienced. And I became connected to the city, connected to the people, and connected to the history. So I designed a cultural exchange program to get people out of the West Coast bubble, as I call it, and it's real, y'all, and bring them back with me to honor the second principle of Kingian nonviolence, which is that the beloved community is the framework of the future. What Dr. King meant when he referenced to the beloved community was a society where everyone had the resources and support to reach their maximum potential. The beloved community is everyone, and this is important. It's not just your family or your circle of friends. It's not just the people that you get along with. The beloved community encompasses everyone, especially those that are hard to love. I know that it's a hard concept for many people, especially in my training. I get this question a lot. I get questions like, but what about the racists? Nonviolence is rooted in unconditional love, or agape, as Dr. King referred to it. It's a disinterested love, not one of brotherhood or intimacy, but the love for another simply for existing and to acknowledge the good that we're all capable of. Racists, white supremacists, violent people are all just the result of their environments. Inviting them to be a part of the beloved community invites them to look within themselves, change, and be a better person. With all of its beauty and warmth, however, there is another side to the city. Suffering, pain, violence, voter apathy, and inequality. Now, to put it in perspective, in 2016, Selma was rated the most dangerous city in Alabama and the 8th most dangerous city in the entire United States. In 2015, when President Barack Obama came to march across the historic bridge, the Ku Klux Klan, who's very still active in the area, came and distributed 30,000 recruitment flyers throughout the city. But how could the city, known for nonviolent social change, become such a violent place? This is the question that catalyzed the creation of the Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation, and is now celebrating its 5th year of operation. In order to respond to the incredible levels of violence in Selma, community leaders joined together to create an organization to address what has happened in the historic city. And to do that, they know that as an organization they must focus on principle number 3 of Kingian nonviolence, which is to attack forces of evil, not those doing evil. But what does that look like? How do you begin to address issues like political repression and segregation, rampant poverty, the lack of access to fresh organic foods, and voter apathy? Local leaders in Selma emphasize that since the voting rights movement, Selma has been used as a case study on how to demobilize movements and disenfranchise communities of color. Through political and social conditioning, there has been systemic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal violence that has resulted in a damaged community. Their philosophy: physical violence, emotional violence, and economic violence all need to be addressed to be able to heal Selma. A foot soldier once said, if you cut off the branch of a tree, it won't die. It'll just grow another one. You have to get at the root cause of the issue. One of their main criticisms is that they feel that the rest of the country has forgotten about Selma. After the voting rights movement, they say they were abandoned and now just serve as a photo op for people to come walk over the bridge just to leave without doing anything to support the people of Selma. So I'm here to let you know that we can all be a part of the solution. They want our support, but they don't want saviors. They're working to rebuild their city and regain their power, but it takes sacrifice. Which brings us to the fourth principle of Kingian nonviolence: accepting suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. Seeing the local leaders sacrifice every day in Selma affected me. They're overworked, underpaid, and they're struggling to support the community. Each time I'm there, I witness individuals work 7 days straight, going to bed at midnight and waking up at 5 a.m. just to do it all over again. Some of them have lost children and grandchildren to violence or a lack of health insurance, yet through all of it, they preach the message of forgiveness, love, and unity. Their work requires a lot of energy from them, both physically and spiritually. Just like the lunch counter sit-ins, they need to put up with physical violence without retaliation. These leaders accept suffering knowing that it's for the greater good. Because suffering can be redemptive, but each must have an outlet. Some walk, some sing. Even though it's hard to find, they found ways to deal with their stress. But for the children, it's even harder. There are very few outlets for them to express their creativity amongst all of the strife and suffering. And those outlets are important to avoid internal, emotional, and mental suffering. And this highlights the principle 5, of nonviolence, which is to avoid internal violence of the spirit, as well as external physical violence. This is where they need a lot of support. Since my first experience, I've brought with me practitioners in yoga and holistic healing and health, music teachers, construction specialists. They've all made an impact, but there's something that needs to focus on the concept of healthy eating, because Alabama has one of the highest rates of obesity, with 36% of adults reporting as obese. Mississippi's the first at 39%, so just to put that in perspective. A lack of healthy food contributes to health problems stemming from poor nutrition. And what's important to understand is the history of systemic disenfranchisement of black farmers in the South. With the loss of land and ancestral knowledge, these options for growing their own food no longer exist for many Southern black families, creating a lack of food sovereignty. Food justice is something that should be incredibly important to all of us. Not only because it provides access to clean, healthy foods, but also because people often find a sense of purpose, relaxation, and positive mental health when working with the earth. I'm working currently on bringing these concepts to Selma through my program. Now, I know that was a lot of doom and gloom, right? When we're talking about the current situation of Selma, but that brings us to the final principle of Kingian nonviolence, which is principle 6, the universe is on the side of justice. This is the principle of hope, the principle that emphasizes that things may be dark now, but they will be better one day. This is what makes us, or me specifically, know that even with all the problems that faces Selma right now, there's hope. We must ensure that we're not acting as saviors as we travel to this historic city, but instead with the intentional support from people like us, people from outside of their community, the people of Selma will find their own power, will find the purpose, the passion, and change their own community to reflect the beauty of the people. In the historic mountaintop speech, Dr. King laid it out for us. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountaintop. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people, we will get to the promised land. Just winning the vote was not enough for Selma. But there's hope. With that perspective and the principles of nonviolence to guide us, I ask that you join me in the fight for Selma. Come with me on a trip to the Deep South that will change your life, and quite possibly change the lives of the people of this majestic, historic, and beautiful city. Thank you, and may peace be with all of you.